Leave it to the brand new pastor of First Baptist Church to assign the story about two sons fighting and killing each other to the pregnant lady. Thank you, Griff, who is not here this morning. Kate Spencer Lyle texted me the other day, "Wow, you're preaching while pregnant? That's going to be emotional." Maybe instead of singing in your sermons, you'll be known for crying? Leave it to my former FBC kids to keep me humble. The good news is I love this text, and not just this one. As the Atkins, Valentine, Strickland, Norris, Graves, and Avant kids can tell you, I love the Old Testament. And more specifically, I love the Hebrew scripture of Genesis. It's right up there with To Kill a Mockingbird, The Color Purple, Their Eyes Were Watching God, and The Little Prince. As Griff reminded us last week, Genesis 1 starts off with a swirl of action with just one word. God sets the world in motion, creating order out of chaos, the story perfectly mirrored by poetic and priestly language of worship found in Genesis 1. I love how Griff explained the poem via its verbs: created, separated, spoke, saw, named, blessed, and rested. Genesis 2 and following has quite a different rhetoric, however. This author's strategy for describing God and creation focuses less on how powerful God is and more on how loving and how near to us God is. The text anthropomorphizes God, who in this creation story walks in the garden. Heavenly hands dig into the mud, and God isn't afraid to get dirty. Halfway through this creation story, we realize it was good probably isn't going to make it into this refrain. We read about loneliness and a God trying to make companions, first animals and then a woman, for the first human whom God desperately wants to be happy. There aren't just forests, but good trees and a bad tree. There's a talking animal who uses manipulation to get what he wants. Genesis 2's creation story stands in direct contrast to the systematic, intentional, and good Genesis 1. And of course, you know the rest of the story, right? After a game of telephone from God to Adam and Adam to Eve and Eve to the serpent, Eve eats some fruit, Adam joins her in delicious juiciness, and they are thrown out of the garden for disobeying God. Adam has to work the fields, and Eve has to painfully give birth to new life, and sure enough, their first child is born, followed by a second. The brothers grow old enough to choose their own vocations, Cain taking after his father in agriculture, and Abel starting a new business in animal husbandry. One brother's a farmer, and one's a rancher. And cue sibling rivalry. At 8 years old, the youngest Pittman daughter announced she would not be doing theater. She performed in Fiddler on the Roof in the historic Missouri Theater. When it finished its run, the precocious little thing announced that she was done. She had two older sisters in theater, and after one show herself, she decided she would have none of it. To this day, Emily still won't let my parents put up the adorable picture of her in Anna Tevka up on the wall next to the rest of the family's pictures of all the theater memories. If Anne and Amy were going to be in plays and musicals, Emily was going to play tennis. The end. Except sibling rivalry never seems to end, no matter how grown up we become. So the competition begins. Cain tills the soil to produce crops just like Dad. Abel also needs land, but he needs it to tend sheep. As such, Genesis 4:5 indicates a farmer versus herdsman mentality. And later, when Cain establishes the first city in verse 17, it may indicate an urban versus rural rivalry. And without reading the rest of the book, you can probably already guess which vocation the Israelites adopted as well. Much of Genesis 1 through 11, which is known as prehistory, could be described as etiology. And etiology is the study of why things exist, and it can be both scientific and mythological, both of which carry their own elements of truth. In other words, when a kid asks a parent, "Why does everyone in our family grow up to shear sheep?" the answer might be, "Well, once upon a time there were two brothers." Or, "Mom, why don't snakes have arms and legs?" "Well, once upon a time there was a garden." Or, "Grandpa, where do rainbows come from?" "Once upon a time there was a flood." But back to this story. The brothers choose vocations and the seeds of sibling rivalry are planted, but the competition escalates when for some reason the brothers decide they need to make an offering to God. Remember, we're at the beginning of the Israelite story. We're in prehistory. We're only in chapter 4 in the first of 39 books. There's been no Sinai at this point, no law, no temple, no rules about sacrifices to God or worship guidelines. But the two men make an offering. Cain gives something he grew, and Abel gives a firstling of his flock. And God plays favorites, praising Abel's offering. Oh man, was that a bad idea? The Pittman parents can tell you, you never praise one daughter without having something good to say about the other two. Obviously, God missed the Parenting 101 class offered 7th period right after home ec. Clearly, the favoring of his brother upsets Cain. So God confronts Cain about his sunken countenance and warns him to mind his P's and Q's. But Cain invites Abel to go into a field. They fight. Abel dies. And again, God confronts Cain, who responds with the now iconic, "Am I my brother's keeper?" When looking at a Hebrew text, I like to head to the original interpreters to perhaps get a feel for how Jews, and dare I say Jesus, would have heard the story. Just as Christians have Walter Brueggemann and N.T. Wright and Jen Hatmaker, the Jews had their rabbis who wrote about the Hebrew texts. Their interpretations of the stories were collected in what's called a midrash. Rather than exploring the etymological "why are we herdsmen" questions, the midrash raises the questions, why do we fight? Why do we go to war? One answer we've already covered. We fight over land and property, and the second should be right behind it. We fight over religion and what we think God likes best. Fortunately, here in America, we've matured to the point that we no longer fight about land, property, or religion, so we'll just keep right on digging into this text. The Midrash offered one interpretation that focuses less on the why and more on the conversation afterwards. Look at the infamous verse 9. The word that Cain uses for the pronoun I, am I my brother's keeper, is the word anarchy. The first person pronoun usually used by people is ani. But Cain uses anarchy, a rather uncommon word. In fact, anarchy is only used a few times in the Bible, and most famously it's used in Exodus 20 at the beginning of the 10 Commandments. Anarchy, the Lord your God. I am the Lord your God, with anarchy denoting God's uniqueness. Thus, the rabbis understand Cain's use of the word anarchy here not as a first-person singular pronoun, but as another name for God. In other words, Cain doesn't ask, am I my brother's keeper? But rather, isn't God the guardian of my brother? Here we perhaps have the first person to raise the question of theodicy. Can God and evil coexist? Was it not God who was tasked with protecting Abel? Was it not God who failed? Eve didn't know what death was when she argued with the serpent. Is it fair to say that Cain did? In this interpretation, Cain switches the devil made me do it argument around and actually blames God. You planted the evil in me. You didn't protect Abel. You're responsible. Not to pin the blame on the invisible God in the room, but this interpretation raises a question we've all asked. Why do bad things happen to good people? But God is having none of that argument. And like his parents, Cain is cast out. The family of 4 brutally became a family of 3 and is finally back to a family of 2. Mom and dad, alone. But like any good firstborn child, Cain isn't going without a fight. You can't do this to me. Haven't you heard of capital punishment? They're going to kill me. Do I not matter to you at all? He laments to God. Oh, of course, if you're trying to read the Bible literally, you should just give up now and go home. The Bible's truth-telling is much more sophisticated than science or history. It's storytelling. And as if the 2 different creation stories weren't evidence enough, any 8-year-old who can read from left to right would respond to Cain's lament with, I'm sorry, but what people? We must set aside our need for facts and embrace our need for truth. That's the great part about Judaism, Jesus' religion. One story can have multiple meanings, and all of them can be true. That's why Jesus never answered a theological question with an ontological truth statement. Instead, he told stories, not just stories, confusing parables. Somehow in the 2,000 years since Christ, Christianity has managed to lose that beautiful part of the Judeo-Christian story. Told in its entirety, that story is a tradition of so many stories and so many truths inside them. This is gospel. This is literature. Genesis chapter 1 was poetic liturgy, like what Louise creates Sunday morning. Chapters 2 through 4 is storytelling. And it is in this story that we learn about what is perhaps the most beautiful and poignant truth about God. Cain said to the Lord, "My punishment is greater than I can bear. Today you have driven me away from the soil, and I shall be hidden from your face. I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth, and anyone who meets me may kill me." God's response? Not so. And then the hand of the God reached out like in the iconic Michelangelo painting of Cain's dad, and he puts a mark on Cain. God marked Cain, mine, safe, protected, do not disturb, Sate's taken. Hollywood got it wrong. Even the Indigo Girls got it wrong. The mark of Cain is not a curse. It's the ultimate sign of grace, of hope. It's the first act of amnesty. It's the first of a lot of things. It's the first story of the preference of God for a younger child to an older child. Soon to follow is a preference of Isaac over Ishmael, Jacob over Esau, and Joseph over his 11 brothers. Cain has been called everything from the first ginger, thank you Shakespeare, to the first black person, thank you white supremacists. But my favorite first is the grace God pours on Cain. I was reminded of God's narrative, which is told over and over in the Bible while watching X-Men movie, Days of Future Past. In it, Charles Xavier says, "Just because someone stumbles and loses their path doesn't mean they're lost forever." That is biblical truth. And to make sure Cain gets the message, God gives him a mark, and he gives him back his life. It's a motif that repeats all the way through the Gospels. It doesn't matter what you do or who you are, whether you're a foreigner named Ruth or a disciple named Peter or a Pharisee named Saul. There's always hope. Dying to self, we each are resurrected to walk into the newness of life every single day. And thank God, because the world is getting darker and darker. I can hardly read the news anymore in order to preserve the health of my baby and my own sanity. The people we put in power to protect us are killing us. They're shooting our black children. They're taking away our health care. They're putting semi-automatic weapons into the hands of criminals and people with mental health issues. And we're letting them do it. We're culpable too. We participate in this system of haves and have-nots. Never mind the gap between the billionaires and the homeless people. What about the gap between the millionaires and the lower middle class? I remember when Steve Mines and I took the FBC college kids to an orphanage in Temuco, Chile. The people who ran the home drove us around town one day to show us the depth of Chile's disparity. They drove us through the shanties where the children and adults alike lived in cardboard boxes and makeshift dwellings, and then they drove us to the other side of town and pointed out the huge houses. "Have you ever seen anything so big?" the guides asked. And I watched my students swallow hard and struggle to answer. Those huge houses were no bigger than 1,500 to 2,000 square feet. And all but maybe one or two of us lived in houses much larger than that back in Austin. If Cain could get angry enough to kill his brother, whom we assume he loved, what will we do? What have we done to people we know nothing about? Every time we cheat on our taxes or take the easy way out, is that one more unfilled pothole in the road? One more unfixed leak in the roof of an East Austin school? Every time we vote for tax breaks on the rich, what is the cost to someone else further down the line? Every time we buy a 48-pack of bottled water, what does that cost the environment? And if you think we as a culture, and cops in particular, aren't targeting black boys and men, then you're just in denial. No one gets bragging rights when it comes to righteousness and God. When I was a teenager and I read a lot of Max Lucado books, I remember he used a jumping as a metaphor for righteousness, and it always stuck with me. I'm paraphrasing, but Lucado said, "Just because some guy in prison can jump 3 inches and you with all your good deeds can jump 3 feet, doesn't put either of you at an advantage when your goal is the moon." And that means that even if the most unpopular person in America, whether from your perspective that's Donald Trump or Stephen Colbert, were to turn to God right now in lamentation and cry out, "My punishment is more than I can bear, I shall be hidden from God's face," even they would hear God's response, "Not so." That's the divine nature of the gospel. I mean, personally, I'd leave the door shut, but God says, "Not so. Anyone who knocks gets to come inside." Not so. No one can separate you from the love of God through Jesus Christ, no matter what you do and no matter what others have done to you. Several weeks ago, my husband and I were invited to New York to have some conversations about the work we do in Colorado on the National Winter Playwrights Retreat. As I tried to decide which of the amazing shows on Broadway I wanted to see during our time there, I texted Griff and Sarah and Jared. The latter sarcastically suggested Spider-Man. Thank you, Jared. Sarah voted for Sunday in the Park with George, starring Jake Gyllenhaal. But Griff said, "Dear Evan Hansen, you have to go see Dear Evan Hansen." And because it's been getting great reviews, and because Griff is my new boss, Dear Evan Hansen tickets were purchased. Evan Hansen, played flawlessly by Ben Platt, is a teenager with social anxiety disorder who tells a lie that quickly escalates from being told to a classmate's family, to circulating the whole school, to going viral on social media. Towards the end of the play, as Evan begins to see the damage he caused, he sings a song of lamentation called "Words Fail." I imagine his sentiments reside in the heart of any person ever afraid that they have screwed up enough that the face of God would turn away.